Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode in this series. We will discuss an alternate history of the 18th and 19th centuries for India. This series is about a likely result that could have come about the best possible outcome for India. The various historical figures in this alternate timeline would not be like the larger than life heroes that we are exposed to in certain media, but pragmatic people who will make decisions that best suit their interests. Think less RRR and more like Bharat Ek Khoj. In this episode, we will talk about how the various states in the subcontinent started to modernize their militaries. It is the year 1757. The French and British forces are locked in the first truly global conflict, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe and the Third Carnatic War in India. A smaller British force defeats a much larger Bengal army of Siraj-ud-Daulah at Palashi in 1757, giving the British East India Company its first foothold in the subcontinent. Upon receiving news of Bengal's defeat, the ally of the Nawab, Governor General of the French East India Company, Marquis de Bussy, realizes that the French interests in the subcontinent are in serious peril unless new allies can be found. To check British influence in South Asia, he seeks help from the Nagpur Kingdom, a faction of the Maratha Confederacy, and the Kingdom of Mysore, who were also inimical to the British. To make sure that these new allies do not suffer the same fate as Siraj-ud-Daulah, Debussy would seek to convince Mysore and Nagpur to not only arm their men with the latest weapons, but also to introduce the European rank structures in their militaries. This has to be discussed in components like infantry, cavalry, artillery, and navy. In our timeline, India's native powers do modernize the equipment of their infantry. Each of the major factions had military units of tens of thousands of troops equipped with flintlock muskets. But the real reason for their poor performance in the Anglo-Maratha and Anglo-Mysore wars was organization. European commanders of larger units were men with experience who had risen from the ranks after serving for decades. While not as meritocratic as a modern army, it was still better than the Jagirdari system, where an inexperienced young man could take command due to his birth alone. Even when controlled for the same quality of leadership, European rank structure also enabled better discipline and contingency during battle. Let me show you what I mean by comparing a European unit of 500 men with a corresponding one organized along Maratha lines. A European unit of 500 men was called a battalion, commanded by a lieutenant colonel with a major as his second in command. Under them, there were 10 companies, each of which was commanded by a captain and 2 lieutenants. Those companies were further divided into 5 sections, each led by a sergeant or a corporal with 7 to 10 privates under them. It was the job of a section commander to make sure his men were well trained and disciplined. This was to make sure that the number of men who would flee in battle was as small as possible. Because when an infantryman did that, it wasn't just one man fleeing from the field. What he was doing there was causing a chain rout. And to make sure that these section commanders were doing their jobs in drilling and disciplining the men, these corporals and sergeants had their men inspected regularly by the commissioned officers of the company, that is, the captains and lieutenants. Furthermore, when facing off against an enemy unit in battle, if the company commander was killed, the lieutenants would then take up command. And in case the lieutenants were killed, you had the second lieutenants who would pick up the baton. Even if the whole company was routed in battle, there were other companies in the battalion who would then act as backup, giving the Europeans a very good system with multiple plan Bs. Now let's compare this 500-man unit to its corresponding Maratha one. According to historian G.S. Chabbra, a Maratha battalion-sized unit had 500 Payaks, which were the same as European privates, and then 10 of these Payaks were under the command of a Nayak, and then 50 of these Nayaks would then report to a Havaldar. As you can see, it would be far harder for one Havaldar to inspect 500 Payaks than it was for 3 commissioned officers of a company to do the same for 40 privates, making it easier for more Nayaks to neglect their work, thus increasing the percentage of poor soldiers than in a European battalion. Furthermore, if 500 men lost their Havaldar due to disease, which was very common in the 18th century battlefield, there was no second in command to turn to. This would make the unit leaderless. If a Nayak was incapacitated, the 10 Payaks reporting under them would be left without a commander, unlike in a European unit where you still had captains and lieutenants to provide leadership. While the cavalry was slightly better, with 25 riders reporting to a Havaldar, 5 of them who then reported to a Jamadar, They still would have the same issues as the infantry with the lack of a second in command in such units. On top of this, the Shiladar heavy cavalry, who paid for their own horses, were more prone to fleeing and less reluctant to join battle. This was out of fear of losing their horse and facing potential financial ruin. There was a serious need for a change in these two branches of the native armies. Debussy meets with Hyder Ali, the soon-to-be de facto ruler of Mysore, and Janoji Bhosle, the leader of the Nagpur state, and convinces them to pursue this change in rank structure. Debussy also urges the two monarchs to incorporate more Western-type artillery. These guns would pose a threat to the British, who had designed their fortifications to counter gunpowder weapons. This meant the creation of artillery batteries with mortars and howitzers. These artillery units could fire projectiles in an hour, thus bypassing the cannonball absorbing redoubts of their star and bastion forts. Nagpur and Mysore were also urged to build cannonball resisting forts of their own, replacing the antiquated ones with brittle outer walls, which would then crumble when fired upon by enemy artillery. They also had to minimize blockades by the Royal Navy, which easily strangled the economy of their enemies with their large ships. Hence, the French Governor General encourages them to create a fleet to protect them against British economic strangulation. This meant larger ocean-faring vessels that could challenge the Royal Navy in blue waters, which were ships that would require gunners and navigators. While Ali and Bhosle are convinced to reform their infantry and cavalry units, they still have serious concerns about the artillery, fortification, and the ships, as acquiring these cannons, forts, and ships would be a very expensive undertaking. As they also did not have the qualified personnel to man these branches of their militaries, they would have to be heavily dependent on foreign mercenaries who were prohibitively expensive. Debussy has a plan for these problems. The first was the plan to save money by disbanding all units of elephants, save for a few for ceremonial purposes. Whether or not they may have been useful in a 14th or 15th century battlefield against inexperienced levy troops is debatable. But when up against professional units of European and sepoy units under European command, they would be routed after just taking 2 musket balls and then go on trampling their own allies. Another problem with elephants was that they would slow the entire force down, as a marching army is only as fast as its slowest component. As a result, an army without elephants would be better able to reach an important strategic position and build defensive fortifications to repel enemy units. This would force the opposing army with elephants to have a larger force to attack this dug-in position. To further increase the marching speed of his allies, Debussy also advises Hyder Ali and Janoji Bhosle to relegate the poorest quality troops in their armies to a reserve force. And without these poorer quality troops, the rest of the units who are now part of an active army could cover far greater distances for a given time. As their infantry units would now have a greater proportion of officers, they could now better identify men who could not meet the standards required in an active force. This saves more money, as an army that can reach its destination in 15 days would consume fewer supplies than one that takes 20. This hypothetical 15 days can be further reduced to 10 to 12 days with a paved road network and supply depots, which would make provisioning the men much easier and also faster. The accountants for Mysore and Nagpur calculate that this is still not enough to pay for all expenses. They also had to make money in addition to saving it, which meant loans for the short term and economic reforms for the long. For both of these measures, Debussy would request assistance from the Dutch, who also, like the French, had a strategic interest in containing the British in the subcontinent. Join us in part 2 of this episode, where the Netherlands assists Nagpur and Mysore in embarking on their agricultural and later industrial revolutions. If you liked the video, then please like, comment, and also subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.